This is Vanessa Gorman. Today we're going to talk about dependency syntax and the valency of verbs in dependency syntax. And this lesson is going to be in English about what we will soon be applying to Greek. So we have some words we've got to sort out. Remember morphology, which is the system of different forms for a different word. Specific identification of the inflection of a given word. So morphology is, for example, a verb in the third person singular aorist indicative active. Now, you've got to make the words fit together properly according to the rules of a language, and that's called syntax. So syntax is the relationship between the words in a sentence. And grammar is the two of these combined, having the correct words and having them formed in the correct relationship to each other. And dependency syntax is the way this course is going to be organized around a structure called dependency trees. And in this system, the verb is the structural center of any clause. We call it the predicative. And it is the highest element in any tree. Now, a dependency tree is just like a genealogical tree in many respects. It is a way of tracing the relationships of words in the sentence back to the more important units and the more important units until we get to the main verb, the predicative, without which we cannot have an independent clause. So linguistic units, which are the words, are connected by direct links and only occur once in the structure of the sentence. I say this because there is a contrasting system called constituency syntax, which is Noam Chomsky's system, which is all the rage in America, but has fallen out of favor for the most part in Europe, and hopefully the Americans will catch up sometime, because Chomsky's system repeats the linguistic elements many times, and it's very, very complex and difficult to learn. And frankly, it works better in languages like English, where we have a fixed word order, our subject, then our verb, then our object. In dependency syntax or dependency grammar, it's much better for languages like Greek or Latin that have a freer word order. They can rearrange the elements of the sentence. We don't depend on word order to figure out what's the subject and what's the verb. We depend on the inflection of the individual words to figure that out. And dependency syntax is nice because it's very straightforward, fairly simple, easy to learn, easy to use. And it does a really good job with Greek. So dependency syntax is the system we're going to be using in here. So here's an example of the two systems, and you see in Chomsky's version, understand has to be repeated and difference has to be repeated, and various elements have to be repeated multiple times, whereas in dependency syntax, everything occurs once. And so we have one tree going in a certain way that looks like this. This is a sentence from Xenophon's Chiropaideia, and you see you have a predicate at the top, which is the main verb of the whole sentence. And then you have different elements hanging down, each one occurring once and once only. And in our system, and this is called Arethusa, which you will access through the Perseids project for free, they very nicely color code the different parts of speech. So verbs are red, conjunctions and coordinators are pink, adjectives are blue, nouns are whatever color that is, adverbs are orange. So men is this, yeah, this is that noun color that is sort of a, I don't know, a teal, I guess. And we're going to use this and we're going to learn how to do it piece by piece. But to do this, we have to understand how verbs work in dependency syntax. There are different kinds of conjugated verbs. So we have transitive verbs, in which the action is carried across to the receiver. That is to say, there is a subject and at least one object, whether expressed or even implied. So the Athenians fought a war has a subject and an object. The war was fought by them has a subject and an object, even though the object is actually the thing doing because it's a passive. Sosius obeyed. There's an object implied there because you don't just obey in the abstract. You can walk without an object, but you can't obey without there is something you are obeying. So these are transitive verbs that require more than just a subject, in other words. Intransitive verbs don't require more than just the subject. The army marched. That's all we need. We don't need anything to complete the meaning of the verb. We can add things like at dawn, but that's just extra. There's not a necessary object there. So we have transitive verbs and we have intransitive verbs. We also have what are called copular verbs, usually in English. I usually call them linking verbs. These are verbs used to link equivalencies that are put into the same case in Greek. So, for example, the verb to be, I am rich. He is evil. The constructions are labeled in the tree subject and predicate nominative. So I am American. American is the predicate nominative. I am the subject. This works with the verb to be or the verb to become. So Tissaphernes became satrap. Satrap and Tissaphernes are equivalents on either side of a copular verb. The agora was full of people. So the phrase full of people becomes the pronoun or the predicate nominative. Even though it's an adjective, it's acting as the predicate nominative of the sentence. So be careful to distinguish between the part of speech label and the relationship. I'm talking about the relationships here. Other verbs function in the same way besides just the verb to be and to become. Like Cymon felt ill. The only way to describe that is he is ill, he becomes ill, he is the equivalent of ill. Alcibiades was found guilty, the Milesians remained courageous. So these, we get verbs that aren't so predictive that can also have predicate nominatives. So let's talk about the concept of valency. Valency describes the number of arguments a verb requires in dependency syntax. So an argument has to be there. Argument is something that has to be there. So we are usually talking about subjects, objects, and predicate nominatives. These are sometimes assumed rather than expressed, but they still have to be there. Anything that's extra that doesn't have to be there to make the sentence work is called a satellite or an adjunct. And it's usually labeled adverbial, no matter what part of speech it is. If it's extra information, it's labeled ADV. The voice that we talked about, active, middle, passive, expresses the relationship between the action of the verb and its argument. So this is a better definition of voice, actually. If you think about it in terms of these are necessary elements that are being linked by the verb. So the arguments of a verb, they can be zero valent. That is, a verb doesn't need anything else to complete it. But these are very rare, and they tend to be weather words. Like it rains, it snows, it sleets. There is no it there. We're not implying the sky or nature or something. It's a state of being, and it doesn't really mean anything. So these are called zero valent words, and there's not very many of them. There are monovalent words. These are intransitive verbs, right? The things that only need a subject. Let the games begin. The chariot crashed. We don't need anything else to finish the meaning of the verbs. Bivalent verbs, bi meaning to, obviously require two arguments. The argument that performs the action and the argument upon which the action is performed. These can be active, where Themistocles made ships, and Themistocles can't just make without some kind of object for that making. These can be passive. The war was begun. There's always going to be an implied by somebody, Xerxes, the agent and the element upon which he is acting. This is also something that impersonal verbs fit into this category. Impersonal verbs are verbs that don't have quite literally, a personal subject. It is better, it is clear, it is necessary. And in this sense, what we do is we make the infinitive that's usually put in here the subject. So to leave is better for Kaimon. To leave is better than to stay, right? This is where we get the infinitive forms as substantives that we mentioned last time. Again, we're not going to deal with infinitives for a while, but they are there. For Kaimon, to leave is better. For Kaimon, to leave is a clause, sorry, a phrase. Kaimon is the subject of the infinitive. So the infinitive is actually the subject of is, and better is the pronoun. Confused yet? It's not so bad, actually. You just have to think about, is it necessary or is it not necessary? We can get as many as trivalent words. So think of words of sending or giving. The Athenians sent Sparta reinforcements. So you give someone a gift, right? You have what we would call in English a direct object and an indirect object. In Greek, in dependency syntax, we simply label both of them as object. We don't distinguish them. So it's simpler. And you can express objects with prepositions. Place to which, for example, is usually expressed with a preposition, even though it's considered an object of many verbs. So the Athenians sent reinforcements to Sparta. Sparta is the indirect object, but it's expressed with a preposition. It's still the object. You fought a war against, you need the against Mithridates. A few miscellaneous notes. The same verb may require a different number of arguments depending on how it's being used in a context. So runs can be monovalent, but runs can also be bivalent. You run a marathon or you just run. Sometimes when it's not directly stated, you assume it from the context. Max gives to charities implies some direct object of what he's giving. Right? You don't give to charities without something that you're giving. There's also a lot of question whether verbs can have 4 arguments. I think they can, but the grammaticians of the world overrule me. So Darius appointed Tissaphernes as satrap for the Ionians. This would be something called an object complement. You can make someone something, and that something isn't just another object. So I made him, I made him the leader of the group. If I made him the leader of the group, I have changed him somehow, and that becomes something that we call an object complement or an O-comp. This is another, I would say, necessary argument, and you appointed him over the Ionians. Perhaps in this sentence you would say for the Ionians is an adverb then, and that the satrap is a necessary argument. It's argument. You can't always clearly tell whether something is an argument or a satellite, okay? It's the kind of things we argue about, and we have to talk about, and we have to just decide, and it can change on context depending on what the author intends. So there's no absolute right or absolute wrong. Language has an awful lot of nuance in it. All right, we already mentioned impersonal verbs. I want to go through them a little bit more. These are verbs in the third person singular that have no subject in the normal sense. So it's phrases like it is useful and it is clear and it is important, and all those phrases that I usually strike out of student papers and say be more specific. Impersonal verbs occur fairly often in Greek, but we're not going to talk about them for the time being. One could argue that zero-valent words are impersonal. I mean, they certainly don't have a subject. Monovalent verbs, it is necessary to breathe. The infinitive phrase, to breathe, is actually the subject. It is what is necessary. So in English, it comes out as an infinitive. In Greek, it will also be an infinitive. It is necessary for them to eat before they leave. To eat is necessary for them. So we can have an indirect object necessary for someone and a subject. Impersonal verbs are not as hard as they look. They're very intuitive. They don't confuse very often at all. We will get to them separately when we get into the second unit. But meanwhile, let's talk about the morphology and valency of verbs so that we can look at these verbs and talk about them. We've already done the morphology. Let's do the valency. So attacked, we've already said, is the third person aorist indicative active. The Athenians attacked him. There's two necessary arguments, the Athenians and him, therefore it's bivalent. Did battle, likewise, is an aorist, and likewise we have a subject and we have an object, even though did battle has an implied object, did battle against him. Were victorious and were defeated, third person imperfect. In this case, there is no object. They were defeated, so you could say they're monovalent, or that you could say they were defeated by someone. They could become bivalent, but in this case, they're monovalent. Alcibiades sailed into the Hellespont. Aorist, simple past action, and it's monovalent. Alcibiades sailed. Now, if the verb were Alcibiades sailed into, and we have Greek verbs in sail, to sail in, then we would need a place. Felt, aorist, bivalent. He feels something. You can't just feel. You have to feel something. Used to gather, imperfect, bivalent. You gather something. And communicated, again, we talked about how it was probably imperfect because it's something that is going on habitually. And he communicates something to someone. We would say direct object and indirect object. They would just say two objects, and so therefore it is trivalent. More practice, another passage we've already seen. After this happened, aorist, this happened, so it's monovalent, it's the subject. Came, so Tissaphernes came. Now, Tissaphernes came, but he has to come someplace. You can't just come. You can walk, because that doesn't imply a necessary argument other than the subject, whereas came requires some place to which you are coming. So therefore it is bivalent. Likewise, went is bivalent because we have a sense of went somewhere. We have a sense of destination, place to which we would call it. To visit is an adverbial phrase expressing purpose in this case. Seized and imprisoned, both aorist simple actions in the past, and both are bivalent because someone is seizing something. So we have a subject and we have an object. Ordered, third person aorist, it's trivalent because we have someone ordering someone to do something. Likewise, provided is also third plural aorist and also trivalent because someone is providing something to someone, okay? Made, again, a third person aorist, plural. Bivalent, someone makes something. They made their escape. Had been taken, that depends on whether you think there must be an assumed agent in it or not. Mantitheus, who had been taken prisoner in Caria, who had been taken as a prisoner. I would say it's probably bivalent even. And just for your reference, especially if you know any Latin, a terrific reference work is Harm Pinkster's new Oxford Latin Syntax. He uses dependency grammar and explains it really well. Even if you don't know Latin, you can read a lot about it there. I don't know the equivalent in Greek. I'm sorry to say. I wish there was such a volume because this is incredibly important. We're going to be using dependency syntax to explain how things go together. So the short takeaway from this is if it's a necessary argument, it's labeled subject, object, ocomp, pnom. If it is not a necessary argument, if it is an adjunct or a satellite, it's going to be labeled, the relationship will be labeled as adverbial because even if it's a noun or a verb or whatever, it's acting as an adverb on the main verb of the sentence. So we will explain all this as we move along through the different parts of speech.